Cultural safety today is defined as an encounter between a health provider and a patient, where the health provider looks at the patient and the encounter as one where culture has to be factored in. Culture where safety is a big part of that encounter, and the safety being the healthcare provider would understand this to be a situation where there are unequal power relations, that she or he, the health provider, would be in a more powerful position than the patient and would look at the situation through this, from this gaze, and then would understand too there are a lot of health inequities in the system, and would try and work with the patient through that kind of cultural knowledge, if I can say that, and also societal knowledge. But a lot of times I think what happens with healthcare providers is that they see this as a moment in time. Moments die, so I don't have to there's no takeaway from this except that my encounter had to be culturally safe for the patient. And I think that often speaks to the lack of personal knowledge, personal insights on the part of the healthcare provider. Now, to look at cultural safety through a cultural lens, I would break that up into two parts, if I can use that term. One part would be what I would call social constructs. So cultural safety seen as a social construct, where it is, that construct is ingrained into scientific and reasoned out meanings, explanations, and interpretations. The other part, the other way of looking at cultural safety is to look at it through a cultural truth lens. Now, cultural truths are those age-old beliefs, practices, values that we've held dear for a time immemorial. And so I think that would be the preferred way of looking at cultural safety, because if we look at it through that mechanistic lens, through the scientific lens, we factor away the human face in that encounter. But if we look at it using a cultural truth lens, then we would be leaning heavily against just looking at the patient as a patient, but we would be looking at the person we're providing health care to as a human being, with a human face, with a person who is of the earth and with the earth, and that we have a normal really we have relations with that patient, rather than just thinking this person is a number. Cultural safety in many ways means that we just take careful aim at that patient in the records, in the files, in our texts, in our emails, but we factor away the human side of the individual, or in fact, if we want to look at it as the family or the community. To just use cultural safety as a jumping off point, and to use the Wabano Center for Aboriginal Health as the place and the space where health care would be provided, it's very important to understand and work with Indigenous concepts of seeing and knowing and doing. And Wabano is is a very exceptional name because it means new beginnings. And because we're talking about new beginnings, there's a strong suggestion that we also have to consider old endings. And when I say old endings, I'm talking about using indigenous concepts, indigenous thought, indigenous aspirations. And it's also very critical when we talk about the Wabano Center for Aboriginal Health to think about helpers. Because even though Wabano is a big institution, lots of people work here, but we have to think of the people who work here and the people who come here to help out in so many ways. We have to think of them as helpers of a higher order. And by this I mean a higher order meaning Wabano approaches its work through a very cultural lens, and of course the First Nations, Inuit and Métis lens. A Cree concept we use for the word helper is Okikanata Maskate Itzik, meaning the health determiners who are sought out to relieve and revive one's human reserves in the struggle towards health and well-being. Another Cree concept we have for the word helper is Ugikana Tuskamake. These are the health determiners who shout out the ones who are faltering under the burden of health detriments. There are two main messages about the concept helper in Cree. One is shout out. The other is sought out. When a helper is sought out, the helper is necessarily being sought out by homeless spirits. When a helper shouts out to the homeless spirits, he or she or they are singing them home. There are at least two ways of looking at cultural safety, as I've said before. One is more mechanistic and mundane, if I can use those terms, more a theoretical formulation. The other is, so that would be unpacking social constructs. The other way of looking at cultural safety is by unbundling cultural truths. So it's maybe a bit of a compare and contrast, but I think at the end of the day, someone might blend these, or we might understand these at some point coexisting, or one might override the other in a given situation, or in the way we see one another, the way we perceive one another, or the way we internalize the concept cultural safety. So if we are to look at unpacking cultural safety as a social construct, then we're looking at it as a fact. If we're looking at it as unbundling cultural truths, we're looking at it as a feeling. On the one hand, cultural safety stands on authority, and that would be the unpacking social construct column. When we unbundle cultural truths in juxtaposition to standing on authority, we see sitting on power as the way of being and doing. When we unbundle cultural truths, we're looking at a spiritual compact. When we're looking at unpacking a social construct like cultural safety, we're necessarily dealing with a social contract. So if we look at both sides of the middle and how we have to negotiate both sides of the middle so that we land in a place where we're comfortable with how we're perceiving, conceptualizing cultural safety, we'll look at parts of it that might resonate with you as well as the people who are coming to the Robino Health Center. So on the one hand, when we're unpacking social constructs, we need to look at facts. So there's a lot of data, information, knowledge that has to be compiled so that we understand cultural safety in its deepest sense. And so there are facts around it. It was developed as a theory, but we also have to pay a lot of attention to the feelings that are a part of cultural safety, the feelings of how comfortable people are in a healthcare setting. Feelings also suggest a wider sensory analysis. So what we see, what we hear, what we feel, what we touch, and smell when we enter a health care institution are all a part of unbundling the cultural truths around cultural safety. As far as the social contract piece and the spiritual compact dimension of cultural safety, we need to pay attention to it as something that we aspire to, something we work towards, something that is relational between the health institution and the person who's coming to the health institution for help. So to me, that's the social contract. And there's all kinds of consent forms to be signed and all kinds of admission forms to be signed. That's a part of the social contract. The spiritual compact is much deeper. The spiritual compact has to do with how we relate to each other in the deepest of senses. We use the word spirit a lot today in our language. We incorporate it a lot, and it is that part of our encounter with health professionals, health institutions, that is not tangible. It's sort of, we can't grasp it, but it's there. It's that deep understanding, that deep connection. It's not a cautious connection. It's just a real trusting connection we have with the institution we're a part of, and the cultural safety that we adhere to as a part of this connection with that institution. So on the one hand, it is okay to be cautiously connecting, but on the other hand, there should be a whole lot of trust. And those are the concepts: trust, respect, and even affection, attachment. We talk a lot about access to healthcare, but we don't talk enough about attachment to healthcare and health institutions. Access is one thing, to feel really attached to a place where that provides care is quite different, and that speaks to the spiritual compact nature of cultural safety. So we're looking at it through very much a cultural lens when we talk about spiritual compact. Both are important, both can coexist very nicely and neatly, but at different times one may supersede the other depending on the situation. So if there's a ceremony, it's more of a spiritual compact. When we drum and we sing together, that is really a covenant. It is not just a simple act of praying. We've entered into a covenant with each other. And so the helpers who come from the wider community are entering into a covenant when they come to the Wabano House Center to drum and to sing and to have opening ceremonies. Unpacking cultural safety as a social construct means to stand on authority. That's in its widest, most broad, mechanistic sense. It's standing on authority, whereas if we unbundle it as a cultural truth, we're really sitting on power. Meaning, on the one hand, there's authority. Authority stands and power sits, is the saying. So to really provide appropriate health care to the people who come for health care of any kind, of any sort, whether it be for mental health problems, whether it be for physical problems, social problems. A lot of our health care today is because we've lost our social moorings or our social supports. That's where a lot of our healthcare problems arise. And without those social supports, it's hard to feel powerful. So a lot of times we may resort to the politics of the powerless, if I can say it that way, because we sometimes don't know our power, and really it is as individuals, as families, as communities, we have an incredible amount of power, and that we can